January 28th, 1986, these 7 astronauts blasted into space and lived 72 seconds. You might remember or recall this person in particular, Christy McCullough, school teacher from southern New Hampshire. Let me just paint the picture of what was going on in 1986. NASA for years had been arguing for the space program because they said it would make money. Sound familiar in today's environment? Whatever. We're doing this not for science, but because it will make money for the United States. We'll find new ways of growing minerals. We'll discover new fields, new enterprises, new ways of building the future. Of course, it was a total failure in making money. It was a money sink. And so early in the 1980s, Congress started to say, why are we funding this thing? This thing is not doing anything more than helping the scientists at MIT or whatever publish papers. So NASA, in its wisdom, came up with this PR idea of a nationwide search for the first non-NASA engineer to go up into space. And after a year-long search, they identified Christy McCullough. Now, at the same time, this launch had been postponed several times because of inclement weather down in Florida. And when they finally came up with a new date, it was Ronald Reagan's State of the Union Address Day. He was going to have a video hookup with these 7 astronauts that night from the halls of Congress. Now remember, 1986, to have a video hookup anywhere was a big deal. So, enormous political, fiscal pressures on this launch. And oh, by the way, it's hard to remember quite how big the booster rocket was. 150 feet tall, 40 meters in circumference, roughly 2/3 the size of this room. And the 2 main fuel cells, these 2 were separated by 1/4-inch thick rubber O-rings. Morning of the launch, 29 degrees on the launch pad. 10-foot-long icicles are hanging on the outside of the booster rocket. And the question was, is it safe, given these conditions, to launch? What I'm going to show you is a video reenactment of the discussions preliminary to the actual launch. Now, before I show you this, though, every word in here was tape recorded. This is not Hollywood. This is not some script writer's idea. Every word was tape recorded. What you're going to hear is you're going to see 2 scenes. Scene number 1 is 6 months earlier in the offices of Morton Thiokol. Morton Thiokol was the subcontractor to NASA responsible for manufacturing and maintaining the booster rockets. Now, you'll recognize several actors. You'll recognize Peter Boyle, who played young Frankenstein and so on. He's playing Roger Beaujolais. Roger Beaujolais was the engineer, Morton Thiokol, responsible for the O-rings. And Beaujolais has been running some experiments because he's worried about a winter launch in Florida. If you go right now on the weather reports, Florida is likely to be sub-zero in the next couple of days. Well, he's worried about how these O-rings will perform if, in fact, there is a cold snap. So he's reporting his findings to his bosses. And it sets up the kind of internal culture within Morton Thiokol. Then the second scene is you are in NASA and Morton Thiokol's offices night before the launch. True story. And they're literally going through a checklist. And they get to the point where they say, do you think it's safe to launch? And Morton Thiokol, for the first time ever, says no. NASA goes through the roof. And all I want you to do is listen for the dynamics around, were these a team? Were they helping each other? What was the decision-making process? How did they get from no, don't launch to it's okay. Go ahead and launch. Here is orthothiocal and Nassau. Should we launch?
I hear you've had a couple of new thoughts.
I'm good. All right, let me stop it.
Yes, I do. I wrote a memo to Bob Lund about it.
Yep. Oh, you know what? I have to guess. I'm sorry.
Oh, no problem. I have to just
2 seconds, guys. Sorry.
have to escape this room. So,
Yep. All right.
She ended up leaving that. So
I was in fourth grade. Everyone watched TV reviews of it. Chris, get it.
I hear you've had a couple of new thoughts.
Yes,
Yes, I do. I wrote a memo to Bob Lund about it.
Well, what's the meat of it? Would you mind telling us?
Since Flight 17, we know something we didn't know before. The primary O-ring can fail completely. If that ever happens in one of the major sections of the rocket, it's a jump ball as to whether the joint holds or fails. If it fails, there'll be a catastrophe of the highest order. Loss of human life. The shuttle, the launch pad, all of it.
Roger, you're keyed up about the O-ring problem because O-rings is what you work on. It's what you see every day. Now, we got to fix this O-ring problem. There's no question about that. But, Roger, the shuttle has flown 19 times, and it's come back 19 times. Our job isn't to run around like Chicken Little hollering the sky is falling. It's to keep that shuttle flying.
I think everybody's hooked up.
Arnie Thompson and Roger Boisgelet have been doing the research. They'll make the presentation.
The Air Force estimates 29 degrees at launch tomorrow morning.
We have no data on O-rings operating at temperatures this low.
So determining if this extreme cold will affect the O-rings, and if it does, how much is critical.
So our recommendation is, you should see it on the sheet coming through now, not launching until the temperature is at least 53 degrees.
Whoa. Oh. Wait a minute. Am I looking at the right charts? Charts I've got don't support that conclusion.
They do. I think they do.
Well, you began by saying what you're presenting can't be proved. And I agree, it can't. But now you're drawing serious conclusions from it, and you're making very serious recommendations.
Serious recommendations are called for.
Well, of course, that's why we're here. But what you're saying sounds like Morton Thiokol is establishing new launch commit criteria the night before a launch. Now, these solid rocket boosters have been operating under very definite specifications. You suddenly want to change them. You now want to base everything on this 53-degree benchmark. At that rate, it could be spring before the shuttle would fly. My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch? Next April?
I don't think we want to change launch commit criteria. We're trying to see if it's safe to launch with the O-rings experiencing these severe temperatures.
All right, I'm looking at your chart on Flight 15. There was erosion. But the worst erosion we've ever had was on Flight 2, and the temperature outside was 70 degrees. Now, where in what you're presenting is the correlation between low temperature and erosion? Your charts even seem to support the opposite.
All I'm saying is that launching it below freezing is an act away from goodness. All I'm saying is we should go by our experience base, as limited as that is. And our experience base says that at 53 degrees or less, we can expect increased erosion and blow-by.
Roger, it's my understanding that the solid rocket boosters are qualified by contract for operation between 40 and 90 degrees. This 53-degree specification would be setting a new benchmark. Are the solids qualified at 40 degrees or aren't they?
It's away from goodness to make any other recommendation.
Listen, if being in the direction of goodness means wanting a successful result for this mission, I want that result. Everybody involved in this telecon wants it. Be reassured, Roger, you are not in the direction of goodness by yourself. But we've got an engineering decision to make here. And it's got to be made on quantifiable data. Now, Well, I want to ask Joe Kilminster for his recommendation.
Based on this presentation by our engineers here at Morton Thiokol, I can't recommend a launch.
I think we should get George Hardy's comments.
Well, let me ask first, does Thiokol have any more to transmit?
Any further views?
Because if not, I'm appalled that they could arrive at the recommendation not to launch, given the data that's been presented, especially so late on the evening before a launch. I agree with Larry Malloy. I make the same assessment he does. But if Thiokol recommends not launching, I'm certainly not going to override it.
We'd like to go offline for 5 minutes here and have a conference.
All right.
I want to make sure I've got this. The worry is the temperatures in the 20s or 30s could cause the primary O-ring to seal more slowly. If it did, we could get some blow-by.
That's right.
But don't we have some tests that show how the O-rings
We have
behave?
tests showing that even if the blow-by cut 125 thousandths of an inch out of the O-ring, it would still seal.
I'll tell you, it makes an impression on me if George Hardy says he's appalled at something we recommend.
His point is, and I think you have to listen to it, is that even if you get blow-by of the primary O-ring, the secondary O-ring is still in the proper position to seal.
Our charts may be inconclusive, our data insufficient, but everything we do have shows we'll be safer launching at 53 degrees or above.
That's clear. That's absolutely clear.
It's time to make a decision. Bob, take off your engineer's hat and put on your management hat.
You're right about that.
This is Joe Kilminster. We've assessed the data and reviewed all our charts.
Even though we had some concerns about the low temperatures, we now recommend proceeding with the launch.
Does anyone in the loop have a different position?
And they went ahead and launched. And those 7 astronauts lived 72 seconds. What I'd like you to do for 10 minutes, at your tables, who do you think was at fault? And more importantly, what did you see in the decision-making process? And one of the things you may want to talk about is, how could you all have run right in, or 5 out of 6 of you, said, let's race. Now, I know it's not quite the same setting, but what are the implications for your own decision making? And let me suggest also that you think about the different players, and particularly George Hardy, most senior NASA person there. And what was his perspective? What was the perspective of the NASA people? What was the perspective of the Morton Thiokol people? Were they teams? Were they working together? Or was there some tension between the different players? Talk for 10 minutes at your tables. We'll go around the room. How about this table? Kick us off. What struck you? Well, first off, wait a minute. Let me first do the poll. So, raise your hand. How many people think NASA was primarily at fault? How many of you think NASA was primarily at fault? Okay. How many Morton Thiokol primarily at fault? You only left with two choices? You're now, okay, both? Okay, good. And then does anybody say neither? No, okay. All right. Your table, kick us off. What struck you in the decision making? Why do you think both were at fault? Whatever, wherever you want to dive in, please.
So, I mean, I'm going to speak for myself. You guys say what you want. It seemed like Morton Thiokol was more at fault because they created a culture, or they had a culture where the person who had been the most vocal felt shut down by the end and didn't feel like he could continue to voice his objections.
Now remember, this is 1986.
Right.
In 1986, much more hierarchical orientation towards authority, towards decision making. So given your comment about Beaujolais being shut down, was Morton Thiokol a team?
No.
No. Morton Thiokol was not a team. So one of the themes of our times together, if you're ever facing a difficult decision, make sure your team is behind you. Because if I'm management and you're making, and your first name is? David. And David's making a presentation to me, and I don't really quite believe it, okay? It started challenging some of my thinking. What am I going to do? I'm going to say, okay, David, okay, I hear you. Do you agree? Do you agree? Oh, you don't agree? We're out of here. You have to have the team behind you, because what's going to happen is you're going to get challenged. And if the team starts fragmenting, it opens the way for management to say, well, because you can't decide, here's what we're going to do anyway. You know, the kind of Carter racing case default. The default is trust the expert. And oh, by the way, the expert was wrong. Now, was he consciously wrong? I don't think so, but he certainly subconsciously was wrong. How about table 4? What did you guys talk about?
We talked about both of them being wrong. At one point in the discussion, when they were having those kind of roundtable conference calls back and forth, someone said, take off your engineer hat and put on your management hat. That's like saying, okay, Hunter, you do accounting for your business. If I do that, we're screwed. So at that point, you're an engineer.
Yep.
Why are you not thinking like an engineer? And then they had also came back, does anyone else in the room have a difference of opinion? No one stepped up to voice that.
Yep. Yep.
Even though they had these drastic concerns.
So 2 points. Number one, the phrase, take off your engineer's hat, put on your management hat. That if you just wrote that phrase, neutrally, it's not a bad phrase. It's trying to say, don't just have a narrow perspective, step back and try and have a broader perspective, right? But how was it presented here? It was presented to shut down Beaujolais. It was presented like, you're an idiot, get on board here, we're the smart people, we see a broader perspective. And then your second point, say again your second point?
They had asked Morton
did anybody,
Thiokol, does anybody disagree?
So leading into that last question, which is always such a emotionally fraught question, right? You know, we've all agreed, we all know where everybody's perspective is, but if anybody has a different point of view, please speak up. No, nobody's going to speak up at the end of the meeting. Roger Beaujolais, 2 years after this, had a nervous breakdown. And he was the only person in this video who was rehired by the reconstituted. Morton Thiokol was broken up as an entity, but the reconstituted entity to maintain and support the booster rockets, he was the only person rehired. No one wanted to work with him. Why was that, do you think? And why did he have a nervous breakdown?
Probably made to be a tacky.
Probably because what? Say it again?
He was the scapegoat.
Okay, he was a scapegoat. Please.
I think probably, guilt and sense of responsibility that he did.
Sense of responsibility, absolutely. But why would no one want to work with him? He had the answer. He was right.
He didn't stand his ground.
He didn't stand his ground. That's what I thought. Now remember, this is 1986. You ready for this? No one wanted to work with him because he was not seen as a team player. Are you on the team or are you not part of the team? Even if the team is wrong. Here's where those emotional issues around decision making are so critical. And if we don't recognize some of those and set up some structures in a sense to offset some of those emotional responses. Now again, 1986, much more hierarchical environment. My dad was an OBGYN here in Boston at the Brigham and then the Faulkner when he retired. And in his day, when he went into the OR, he was the chief of the ship. Nobody challenged him. And in fact, it was why he was a terrible person to go sailing with, because you could never do anything right. He was Captain Ahab. But anyway, today, you don't go into the OR. Well, every person there signed, as you all know, signing off on, this is the patient, this is the blood type, it's this knee, it's not that knee. And everybody's responsible, even if it's outside your area of expertise. If you see something going on that you challenge, you stop things. That's a totally different environment than what we're seeing here in 1986. So you also want to be sort of thinking about this in the context of how we've evolved, but maybe also how we've not evolved. How about you guys? What did you talk about? Please.
One thing we discussed is, really the culture of Morton Thiokol, because this issue came up 6 months prior.
Yes.
And why are they now discussing it
Right.
the night before?
Right. And that wonderful line, don't be chicken little. You see, you're responsible for the O-rings, so you see everything as a problem or an issue around the O-rings. You need, again, having that broader perspective. What is it we say when you move up into a typical organization? Don't you have these criteria, right, for leadership? One of which is having that bigger sense of what's going on, not just being locked into your functional expertise. But at the same time, you want to value that functional expertise. You want to ask yourself, well, maybe the reason we've been successful on those 19 earlier flights was by luck. And if it was by luck, what are we going to do about it? What else? What else struck you? Please, some of the other. Yes, Will, and then back here. Yeah.
One of the things that our group brought up was that you literally had the expert on the O-rings telling you this is a problem.
Right.
The expert.
Right.
And they shut him down.
Totally.
So if you have an expert in something on your team,
yep,
and they're telling you it's a problem, you should probably listen to the expert.
Okay.
Or
please.
I can think of just so many work situations where, the health, the safety and quality person is saying like, absolutely,
right.
no way
Legal
can we go against
says,
J-code. But then the finance person is saying, but if we do, we could save $70 million and keep our system solvent. Like those different perspectives really, I mentioned at the table, like that team of rivals idea, that everyone's at the table
great image.
feeling safe enough to share their point of view that is unique.
Let me get over here and then you. Please, go ahead.
Hunter made a good point that at no point in these discussions, unless we missed it, did they talk about the cost in terms of human lives.
Yeah. Nowhere. Nowhere. Why do you think that was? Again, 1986.
It wasn't a metric.
It wasn't an issue. It actually was not an issue in 1986. And the assumption was, now part of good decision making, I'm going to argue this afternoon, is actually surfacing your assumptions. Because if we start a big discussion and you think this is a growth problem, and you think this is an efficiency problem, and we don't surface that right off, you're going down different paths. In 1986, or the 1980s, the assumption was every one of these individuals had already put their lives on the line. They were like test pilots. And so you didn't have to talk about the risk to them. Today, I think we would have a different calculus. But then it was, hey, you're fodder, and the question is it too risky to take the launch? Now, did you also notice how they shifted very quickly to an engineering problem and then a contractual problem? What does that do to the emotional side of any of this decision making? Right. It makes it, we're just neutral observers here. We're just making the best decision possible. And they marched down a path that was catastrophic. Catastrophic. Please.
I just want to follow up on the lack of prioritizing the life
Yep.
of the pilots.
Yep.
Because that's an interesting point that you make, that it's thought that they've already put themselves out there, they've put themselves on the line. But then going into that financial point of view, how much money was spent training all of those people?
Oh, absolutely.
And then of course the cost of the
Oh, absolutely.
So
Which also gets at, I think, something I overheard here. What was the overriding issue for Morton Thiokol? The contract with NASA. Biggest contract they'd ever had, $1 billion plus. Now, you don't know this, but that individual in the tweed jacket that says, wait a minute, let me just understand this, he was the business development director responsible for the NASA relationship. You don't think he wanted to maintain that relationship? So you also want to be thinking about where are people coming from, please.
But something that I brought up to the group, and not to sound like a psychopath, right? But like if they had done the decision tree algorithm here, they would have still come up with a conclusion that either way, if we go and it fails, we lose the contract.
Okay.
If we don't go, we lose, and we fail and lose the contract.
Okay.
So they would have failed no matter what. One ends up with the company being potentially losing a contract. The other one ends up with the company losing the contract and this being dismantled.
Well, so what I hear you saying is, had they used a decision tree, had they used some analytic tools, they still would have come up with we should launch. Did I hear you?
I would say they would have come up with we shouldn't launch.
Okay.
If they had done the math, they would have said we end up in a worse position. We end up losing the contract no matter what here.
Right.
In the one situation, we just end up worse if we launch.
So that's one of the themes I'm trying to get across here. When you're facing a major decision, beware of the expert. Beware of your own sense of overconfidence, our ability to get through this. We've launched 19 times, and challenge your own thinking. Let me ask you, and you don't have to respond here, and then I'll give you. Even in your discussions around the Carter Racing case, if you were going to argue against the team, did it feel comfortable? See, this video was actually shown on PBS as part of a series on groupthink. And groupthink is not an analytic process. It's an emotional process. When we're standing off from the group, three things happen. One, we tend to say internally, I must be wrong. Number two, they must have more information than I do. I just don't understand what's going on. Number three, am I willing to die for this project, for this issue? Or do I just go along? Warren Buffett, the most successful investor ever, said too often, I changed my point of view for the collegiality of the team. Most successful investor ever. Please, somebody had their hand up. I'm sorry. Yes.
I mean, this is kind of going away from
That's
where we're at right now, but I'm still trying to wrap my head around. They were going back and forth between the 53 degrees and 40 degrees,
Right.
but the degrees outside were 29, well below the 40. So
You got it. Well, let me tell you, first off, I'm going to show you here in a minute. They did not have as much detail as this chart, and I'll show you what I mean by that. But had they had this chart, this was saying there is no relationship between temperature and engine failure. Partly they didn't have all the data. Partly they weren't asking the question for multiple perspectives. And actually in the commission afterwards, there was a huge commission. One of the scientists sat there in front of the committee and said, well, wait a minute. He took a glass of ice water and he took an O-ring, the rubber O-ring, put it in the glass of ice water, held it there for I don't know how long, took it out, hit it on the table, and it shattered. He said, of course it couldn't withstand 29 degrees. So back to your point, could they have done something else? Do you remember, well, one of the first steps in key decision making, apart from challenging yourself and understanding your assumption, is put other options on the table. Did you hear another option on the table? Actually, there was one. Wait until April.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? Now, how was that even said? Was it said like, hey, Dave, we could wait until April? Or was it said, Dave, what do you want us to do? Wait until April, you friggin' idiot? It was totally said to shut down NASA. So there was no effort to try and come up, well, wait a minute. Maybe we don't launch in the morning, back to your 29 degrees. Maybe we wait till at least it's above freezing. I mean, it may be bad, but it's a lot different than having 10-foot long icicles hanging on the outside of the darn booster rocket. So there was no support between NASA and Morton Thiokol. NASA treated Morton Thiokol like a slave, like a servant. Give us what we want. There was no teamwork internal to Morton Thiokol to stand against NASA. And there was no sense of, we have 7 lives here, let's take a break, let's think about options, then let's come back and decide. Now, I've met a NASA engineer. He said, Jim, you have no idea the checklist they were going through the night before launch. He said it was pages. And that's also the problem. Whenever you're faced with a tough decision, make a distinction between tactical, short-term, small things, and major structural problems. You put those all together, the major structural strategic issues always get shortchanged. They should have led with, wait a minute, is this going to stop? The first time ever, the Louis Thiokol had said, don't launch. Now, who was George Hardy? Remember this? They say, let's get George Hardy's point of view. Most senior guy there. Now, I know you've never been in meetings where the chief of surgery says, oh, here's what we ought to do, and everybody lines up. But let's just go through the thought experiment. So they go to the most senior person. And what does he say? He says, first, does Morton Thiokol have any more data to transmit? Which actually, I thought, yeah, that's a good question. But what does he then follow it with? I'm appalled. So you come in with a recommendation to me, and I first say, oh, this is great. Tell me what you've got. And you say, this is it. That's everything. And I go, well, you're an idiot. How could you possibly have given me that kind of information or that decision? And then he says, we need to launch. He's the senior guy. He's giving you a decision. But what does he finish with? Anybody remember?
He can read it.
With Morton Thiokol. It's the classic Pontius Pilate. If Morton Thiokol doesn't want it, I'm certainly not going to go against it. So you come to that leader for a decision, and what does he or she say? Here's the decision, but oh, by the way, I'm not standing behind it. Mike Osim, a teacher's leadership, we'll be talking about Mike Osim several times, and his Leader's Checklist, I think, is one of the best books on the reading list. He says there are 3 signs of great strategic leadership. First, they act and think strategically. They're not just focused on short-term, tactical, how do we maintain this contract? Secondly, they make decisions. They make decisions. They move the group forward. But third, and this is what's so wonderful, and we'll talk more about this, he says they lead horizontally. They don't lead vertically based on reporting. They bring others along that don't necessarily report to them. They create a sense of followership. They create a sense of trust. And then they move organizations forward. And unfortunately, my experience, that takes time. It's a lot easier to give an order. It's a lot harder to build trust. I'll also say, he asked Mike Osim has studied leaders, and he asked the question, are certain leadership styles better or worse in certain environments? And his findings are, if you're in a crisis, you want a top-down, take-charge leader. If there was a fire here, we don't want to be going, oh, by the way, let's have a little vote around whether we go out that exit or that exit. No, you want Dave to say, here's the exit, go. But in most situations, that's suboptimal because you're not leveraging the capabilities of the team. You're not getting input from the team. Please.
I just was thinking about the fact that they're having this meeting the day before the launch. Was it because they saw a problem, or was it just routine?
It was a routine.
It was routine, right?
The night before the launch, just the checklist.
Why do you have a checkpoint before the launch for these types of things to come forward, right?
Good question.
So, and then my other thought is, if the team they should have came in with the decision already. You know
well,
what I mean?
If they were a team, they would have. That's the point about Morton Thiokol was not a team.
Right.
They hadn't come together. Also, you have to remember, this is 1986. And we're so used to communicating WhatsApp and, phones and blah, blah, blah. 1986, it was actually hard to communicate with each other. You had to pick up a phone. You didn't, even having a video hookup was a big deal. So part of this was how they were communicating with Nassau, how they were communicating each other, but I actually fault Morton Thiokol. You knew where NASA was coming from. NASA wanted to launch. They were going to do everything you could. Let me hold it, because I want to show you a couple things, and then we have the dean coming in to kick us off before lunch. So these were two of the 13 tables text to NASA at night before the launch. Remember they said your numbers don't even seem to add up to what you're arguing for? I fault Morton Thiokol because Morton Thiokol had not distilled their findings down to simple, understandable terms. I challenge any of us to make anything out of this gobbledygook. First off, they talked about blow-by history. Well, the reason there was, quote, blow-by is just degradation of the O-rings. Has nothing necessarily to do with temperature. The reason there was degradation of the O-rings at 72 degrees was because dirt and soot got into the O-rings during the launch. So they're using a term that itself is not causative. And then they show these results. Well, these first four are test firings. These are actual. So they didn't show the entire history. They didn't show comparable to comparable. Imagine if instead of sending 13 charts, they sent one chart only. Here's all of our firings projecting forward to 29 degrees, better than 95% probability of O-ring failure. NASA, you want to launch? Go ahead. And so part of this is when you're under pressure, remember I've been arguing, let's put options on the table. What do you think happens when you're under pressure? You see more options or fewer options? Fewer options, particularly when somebody raises their voice. Remember at one point, Beaujolais says, I think it's away from goodness. And the NASA guy steps up and he says, you're not the only one who's worried about, we all want this thing to be successful. Beaujolais was questioned by the commission afterwards. And they said specifically, here's what you said. What did you mean by this? He said, I was talking about goodness of fit, data to a curve. That the idea of 2 or 3 distributions away from a center point. One of Beaujolais' problems was he was not a very good communicator. He was an engineer. He saw everything in engineering terms. He couldn't even express himself. And Nassau, or his team, instead of saying, well, what do you mean by goodness? They eviscerated him. And nobody from the Morton Thiokol team stood up for him. This is some work by Yerkes and Dodson, and their argument is when you're under pressure, your performance actually initially improves. That if I reported to Will and Will said, I need you to come in on Saturday, I'm really sorry, I need more work on this, I'd probably initially do better or produce a better report. But I quickly reach an asymptote and fall off. In fact, there was a study of sleep patterns for graduate students. This was a couple years ago. Here was the study. They said, how much do you sleep on average? So you sleep every night on average 8 hours, you sleep 7, you sleep 6. Well, the next week, 1 week only, each one of you needs to lose 1 hour every night. Not cumulative, but just 1 hour off your average. So you only get to sleep 7, you get 6, you get 5. IQ at the beginning of the week, IQ at the end of the week. 20% drop in IQ in that alone. And I know I'm preaching to a profession that seems to glorify. Well, I was on call for 36 hours straight. Boy, I'd hate to be the patient that came in at hour 35, you know? So, I mean, yes, you are trained to be decision makers, as they say in Johns Hopkins, the tip of the spear, when you are under pressure, when you have, limited data necessarily. But at the same time, ask yourself, wait a minute, if we got to make a tough decision here, let's give ourselves breathing time. Let's step back here. Let's, night before the launch, okay, a lot of things are under pressure. Take a break. Can we get some coffee? If you're ever in a meeting and you hear voices rise, time out. beware of somebody pounding the table and saying, this is what we have to do. Because it shuts down decision-making. So throughout this, I hope you take away this wonderful comment from Mark Twain. And I'm rereading Huck Finn. And if you haven't read the book James, these are wonderful reads, I'll tell you. But anyway, Mark Twain said, it's not what we know for sure that gets us into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. It's not our lack of knowledge. It's how we get locked into thinking, I do really understand the world around. The dean's going to come in 2 or 3 minutes. Any other additional comments? Any other additional thoughts, perspectives? Please.
What you just said, because I absolutely love that recommendation for Adam Grant's.
Speak up a little bit, because can you guys hear? Please, go ahead.
Adam Grant,
Yeah, we're going to talk about Adam Grant after lunch.
That was exactly changed my entire perspective on knowing what you know, but actually having to rethink it, because that's literally all of the mistake that happens.
Yep.
They kind of forcefully let everybody to believe in that situation.
Yep.
And think about the other applications like completely.
Right. Right. And that the Adam Grant book, there are 3 books I hope you take away from our session. Number 1 is the Adam Grant Think Again. I think it's one of the best reads on how we all fall into these decision traps. Dan Ariely, who teaches decision making down at Duke, he's written a book called Predictably Irrational. We are all predictably irrational given certain situations. The next book is Vineet Nair's Employees First, Customers Second. And he's an Indian ex-CEO from India, in India. He was head of HCL Technology, 3rd largest IT outsourcing company in India. And the title is a bit tongue-in-cheek, but his point is, if you support the frontline troops, they will be better at solving customer problems than if you centralize everything, typically, around senior management. And lastly is Pfeiffer's The 7 Rules of Power. And I've added that to the reading list this year. I find that a deeply troubling, deeply challenging book. But his point is, if you want to do good, you'd better go after power. I think this whole video, Nassau More Entire, was all about power. It wasn't about who's right, who's wrong. It was who had power, who got listened to, and how the decision was actually made. And we can go into a discussion about St. Augustine versus Machiavelli. We can go down a lot of paths. I love to think we are all motivated by higher ideals. The challenge is when those higher ideals meet power, who wins out? And with that, let me introduce the dean, whom I'm so fortunate to be part of an organization she heads. Please, let's give her a warm applause.